This video will introduce compound interest and point out some of the differences between compound and simple interest. So before jumping into compound, let's review simple interest. The main quality of simple interest is that it's calculated once based on the principal amount. What that means is that it stays the same over time and is not changing. The formula for calculating simple interest is I equals P times R times T, where I stands for the amount of interest, either earned or paid. P represents your principal, which remember is that starting amount. R stands for your rate. It's given as a percentage, but we use it as a decimal. And then T stands for time. And remember, time has to be in years. Now, simple interest is most commonly used in loans, where your interest is calculated on how much that loan was for or that principal amount and does not change until the loan is paid off. Also remember that if your time is in months, you need to change it to how much of a year that would be. So the main difference between compound interest is that it's calculated from the most recent balance. So it's changing every time it gets calculated. In a savings account, it allows you to earn interest on the previously added interest, which is a great thing for you. So in this little diagram, you can see if your balance is kind of the full amount after each year and your principal was $100, that very first time, if an interest rate was 2%, you would get $2 interest. But the next time it's calculated, they're now looking at your overall balance here as $102. So they're going to recalculate the interest off of that, which is where you see just a little bit of change in the interest that you get. So compound interest is a long way of saying it allows you to earn interest off of interest. So let's get down to the basics and as far as calculating interest goes. Compound interest is a form of interest that gets recalculated based on the new balance amount. Not shoes, but like the newly calculated balance. Your previous interest then earns interest, and it's more commonly used for a savings account, not a loan. So this formula is going to look a little intense at first, but we'll walk through it here next. The compound interest formula is capital B is equal to P, and then parentheses 1 plus R, all to the nth power. So that is an actual exponent. Now, some of these letters look familiar from simple interest. That capital B stands for your overall balance. P still stands for your principal, and the R still stands for your rate. But instead of T, this N stands for the number of times compounded. And that's mainly because it can be calculated or compounded more than once a year. So if that's the case, it wouldn't exactly represent the time because it's getting more than just once a year. So now let's look at some examples actually using this formula and how to work something that looks a little intense at first. Example 1 says you open a savings account by putting $500 in it. It earns 1.5% each year. If you leave it for 5 years, what will your balance be? So very similar to simple interest, we're going to start with that formula and plugging in or substituting the various values that we know. So the amount you put into that account would be your principal, so we're going to use 500 as our P value. Then for 1 plus R, we still want to take that rate and change it to a decimal. So this would be 1 plus 1.5%, which as a decimal is 0.015. And then for 5 years, so all to the 5th power. Now, we're starting with just once a year, which is why right now my N matches the time of years. So as far as this formula goes, if we look at this 1 plus 0.015, what this is essentially doing is adding in what you started with. That 1 is essentially 100% of what you started with, plus the new amount of this 0.015. So that's kind of why this is changing. It's taking into account all that you had last time, plus the new percentage that gets added. As far as typing this into your calculator, what I would recommend is just kind of doing this part on your own. So the times 1.015. And then remember on a calculator to do exponents, you're looking for that caret key that looks like this with your 5 afterwards to show to the 5th power. So go ahead and try that out as you're watching along. Now, what I got after plugging that in was a long number, but we're going to round since it's money. So rounded, it would be $538.64. So since this is the first example we're doing, let's talk about that answer. Notice it is your overall balance. So this amount isn't just the interest. It shows already that 500 that you started with. So really, if we were interpreting this answer, the 500 out of this would be your principal. So that difference of $38.64 is essentially the amount of interest you earned. So the main thing to remember with compound interest is it's equal to your overall balance. So this is the total amount, not just interest. All right, let's try another one. Example 2 says you win the lottery and you win $6,500,000. You decide to put all of it into a savings account that earns 1.02% compound interest. After 10 years, what will the balance be? So again, we're still under the assumption that it's just compounded once a year. So as far as starting with my formula, and then I need to pick out the values that I'm going to substitute in. So this $6,500,000 is going to be my principal amount. That is what I started to open up that account. Then my 1 plus, remember that represents 100%. This 1.02% as a decimal, so 0.0102. And then again, my n right now is just going to match my years because we're only covering once a year. So 10 would be the number of times compounded. Again, as far as calculator recommendations, for doing this all at once, I recommend just kind of doing this part on your own. And then that caret key and 10. So it's a much bigger answer this time. Looks like, let me write it out first before I try to read it. And then rounded to 56. So that would be $7,323,496.56. So a lot bigger number, but if you think about it, this principal amount was a lot bigger than the 500 in the last example. So again, this is your overall balance. It already has that $6,500,000 that you started with into account. So your interest would just be the difference off of this. But your overall balance, this already has that principal built in. So now you've seen a couple examples of compound, let's compare it back to simple interest. I have the two formulas up above to reference, but we're going to calculate that interest off of the same starting information. So with simple interest, it's I equals P times R times T. So for an example of a principal of 500, a rate of 5%, and a time of 10 years, that interest amount is going to come from the principal of 500 times the rate as a decimal, and then times the time of 10 years. So if I calculate that, the amount of interest that I would earn or pay, depending on the situation, would be $250. Now remember, that's only the amount of interest when you're doing simple interest. So my overall balance would come from adding back in my principal amount. So here the overall balance would be $750 from adding back that 500 principal. If we switch over to compound interest, different formula this time. I'm going to be taking my principal amount and then multiplying that by 1 plus the rate as a decimal, and then all to the 10th power. Again, on my calculator, I would be recommending doing 500 times the 1.05, and then that caret key 10. Remember to round your answer appropriately since we're working with money. So that would be a total of $814.45. So if you look, it is a little bit different. Compound interest did give you more money. And if we think about why, that's because your old interest is now earning interest. So you can see with a bank account, compound interest is a great thing because it's taking into account you having essentially more money year after year. Other big things to point out is compound interest calculated our balance all at once, whereas with simple interest, we had to calculate the interest first and then add it back for our overall balance. So what I want to leave you with today is just the main differences between simple and compound interest. With simple interest, I would say one of the main difference is it calculates the interest, not the balance, whereas by comparison, compound interest calculates that overall balance. So that's the biggest difference as far as the calculations and the formula goes. Conceptually speaking, a big difference between simple interest is that simple interest is calculated once and does not change. Now, comparatively speaking, the compound interest gets recalculated often, and it allows your interest to earn interest. So since it gets recalculated, it is changing each time. And hopefully if it's a bank account, it's going up and up each time.